At the village a couple of weeks ago, we had an event, an annual event that we have every year called Spiritual Renewal Week. And I was one of the speakers on Spiritual Renewal Week, and I was speaking on a topic that I only had a half an hour to speak, and so I could only introduce the topic and be very cursory about it. But at the end of the topic, I entered into a point where I introduced a few thoughts, but I said there's much more to be said about that. And I didn't really have a chance to finish it. And during this vacation, I kept thinking about, oh, I wish I could have finished that talk. So one of the themes that came into my mind, I want to cover that today. And this is the title of today's talk is Self-Interest versus Self-Interest. Now, one of those selves is a large capital S and the other one's a small s. And if you want to get the background to what I was talking about in the previous talk at Spiritual Renewal Week, you can go to ananda.org, and I'm sure that somewhere in there, they're recorded and they're probably posted. And mine was on Friday, July 2nd. And in that talk, I was introducing the idea of something that we've talked about here in previous classes. We've talked about Dwapara Yuga, the characteristics of Dwapara Yuga. And I was speaking about in Dwapara Yuga, as opposed to Kali Yuga, one of the characteristics, again, if these are new concepts to you, I have to refer you to some of our previous classes and to that SRW talk. But one of the characteristics of Dwapara Yuga is energy. We have entered into an age of energy. We have also, there are other characteristics that are sometimes less spoken about, but we are also entered into an age of Dwapara, which is characterized by individuality, by the individual taking more of a control of one's life. Whereas in Kali Yuga, you could say in that age, a darker age of one has to follow the rules. You're born as a carpenter, you grow up, you become a carpenter. You're born into a certain state in life and you stay in that state in life. And it's more rigid. There's less individual ability to self-actualization of one's potential. Society itself places constraints where this begins to break down as we move into higher ages and individuality becomes more important. And one takes individual responsibility as accompaniment with that individual autonomy that one gains. And a consequence of that is also that Dwapara Yuga, energetic as it is, can be characterized an age where self-interest is very important. One begins to think of I can take control of myself. I can use my willpower. I can use my initiative. I can use my creativity. I can use my concentration to improve myself. I am responsible. And then society, yes, is still there, but this awakening of self-interest. And so you see this reflected in one of the basic principles that Paramhansa Yogananda introduced when he took up his world mission, when he came to America, went to Boston, and he gave that very first lecture on the science of religion. And what was the founding principle of that? That science of religion was based upon everybody is united. Humanity is united in the principle of the individual seeking personal happiness. They're seeking happiness or they're avoiding suffering. In other words, everybody is motivated by that, to seek happiness. Now, you could say, well, that principle was true in darker ages as well, but yet it wasn't characteristic of society as a whole. And that wasn't the dominating principle of Kali Yuga, whereas in Dwapara Yuga, it's much more prevalent. So at the same time, to seek happiness, Of course, happiness is experienced on many different levels. And so you could define also in Dwapara Yuga, one seeks one's self-interest. Now, happiness at the base of is at the basis of that, but we begin to see that, well, self-happiness, self-interest is expressed by my own happiness, which means getting wealthy, being successful materially, outwardly, satisfying all my pleasures in life. All of these things that we define as happiness, peripherally, superficially, that's my self-interest. But I can do these things. I have the ability. If I put out the energy and concentration, I can gratify my self-interest. But really, we're speaking about ego interest, pleasure, lower self-interest, but yet this is a directional state. This in the larger scheme of things, relativistically, we are taking control of our life, and this is encouraged. It's more energetic. It's more energetic. I can do something, and eventually, with the gaining of wisdom, we begin to realize pleasure is not enough. I want something more. And we begin to look within ourselves. And for those few, they begin to realize there's even more. There's even a deeper happiness is really just not of this body. It's not of this personality. It's not of this ego. There's something beyond that. But that's not necessarily characteristically the society's perspective, the majority of people. And so you see this in the world. This is the dominant theme. People are seeking their self-interest. Capitalism is based upon that, and economically, communication, it is based upon that principle. Now, Swami Sri Yukteswar, when he outlined the future, gave very hints of the future, of what we can look forward to in this age that we're in right now. He said, we are moving, though, in a direction. There's a directional arrow in time takes us to go beyond merely ego self-interest, which is what we teach in yoga, and all spiritual religious practice has this as its basis. But we don't make a huge jump from this ego self-interest, little s, to the big S, self-interest, God realization, you might say. We don't make that all at once. There are stages we go through, and the next stage above that little ego self-interest is enlightened self-interest. And this is the characteristic of this Dwapara Yuga that we're in, is the transition from little s to enlightened self-interest. Not the big S necessarily yet, but it's in that direction. Enlightened self-interest is what is the theme that we're working through right now in the world. You look at the trends in the world, people thinking of me first, my country first, everything is me first, others will take care of themselves. And you could say the most basic elements of a monopolistic system, everybody seeking their self-interest will produce the highest good economically. That was Adam Smith's proposal. But even Adam Smith, if you read him closely, said, people must learn, though, one's individual self-interest is best satisfied when they learn to do enlightened self-interest, which means helping other people is in my best self-interest. And so you see this being played out in the world today. Enlightened self-interest versus individuality of self-interest. In other words, and this is what Paramhansa Yogananda and Swami Sri Yukteswar explained, this age that we are entering into, and which will continue now for couple thousand years, is characterized by breaking down those narrow boundaries that separate us, one person from another, one grouping from another, one ethnic group from another, one race from another, one society from another, one country from another, until we see that helping the larger is in my interest. thinking globally is in my self-interest to do this. I gain when everybody gains. Swami encapsulated this idea. He said, if you live in a village of 1,000 people, isn't it better, more pleasant, in your self-interest to cooperate with your neighbors and have a relationship where you have 999 friends rather than 999 competitors, all struggling against one another. This is what's the message of Dwapara Yuga. That you could say the theme that the world at large must go through to get to that point. Now, we're certainly not in that on a global scale, anywhere near that right now, but you can see the seeds of it are being planted. Those people with a little bit of higher consciousness societally are wanting to say, let's all work together to achieve our ends. Now people say, oh, that's so idealistic, not, get mine and then everything, and you get yours and we'll, everybody will be happy. Well, that satisfies a little bit, but it's not enough. The spiritual person, the yogi, the devotee realizes that just thinking of myself is not enough. It's egoic. And so we are expanding in this way. Well, I brought this out in my discourse at Spiritual Renewal Week. And I mentioned something. I said, we're in an age, and as each of us individually as well, participating in that. If we think larger, it's expansive. If we think of enlightened self-interest, why? It's more joyful if one's consciousness is sensitive enough to appreciate that. If we're completely body-bound, we don't appreciate enlightened self-interest. But as we begin to expand our consciousness, we see there's a larger reality, and we expand by thinking of the whole. And whenever there's expansion of sympathy, thinking of others, inwardly we experience joy. And this is what everybody wants. And subtly, we recognize that. And so we begin to be fed by that impulse to the devotee is. And as the next ages, centuries go on, this will become generally prevalent within society as a whole. In the meantime, we have to struggle through. But every age, whenever we are born, it's appropriate for us because we've karmically attracted that circumstance. And so we must do our part. And the person of higher consciousness, the person of aspiration, needs to be a light bearer, a torch, carrying a torch to inspire other people to something higher. That too serves our larger self-interest, and we find ourselves being joyful when we express those values that are ultimately of benefit and help to everybody. But as I explained, is that enough? Is self-interest enough, whether it's simply for myself first, me first, or even if it's enlightened self-interest? Both of those are egoic. And for the devotee, neither of those are enough. Something more is needed. Although it's important that we understand that, yes, we can share the idea that something more is needed, but for most people, they're not going to be receptive to that yet, because it's two steps. In other words, if we're very much ego-bound and me first, you can't be talking about God first. You can. I mean, I think it's good to hold that up as a vision, but it doesn't resonate with what that person who thinks me first needs. What that person needs, he needs to be expanded by an enlightened self-interest. Oh, if I help other people, I benefit. That resonates. If I don't cheat my customers, I'll be better off in the long run. That resonates. If you say, don't cheat your customers because God doesn't approve of that, that that's a Kali Yuga way of saying it. I'm going to suffer if I do that. Maybe out of fear, I don't cheat my customers. But in terms of my own benefit, it doesn't resonate. So we have to give a message to the age we're in and to the people we're speaking to that's appropriate. But nevertheless, we also need to be instruments. Those of us who are devotees, those of us who are wishing to serve a higher purpose, those of us who are wishing to serve our Guru's teachings, we also need to share a higher purpose for those who are understanding that there is something more, because we have to give always to everybody a vision of where we are moving toward, but that message that we share has to be appropriate, translatable to the people who are receiving that. So this is why I always start when I do my meditation teacher training with the admonition: know your audience. To whom are you speaking? What will be helpful to them? What is going to take those people in the direction that they want to go? And so Krishna advises Arjuna and tells him, everybody has their own dharma. And the dharma of one isn't necessarily going to be the right dharma for the others. So we have to be appropriate. But what is needed now? Something that takes us beyond enlightened self-interest. And I introduced the word at Spiritual Renewal Week of it takes sacrifice. We are beyond self-interest, individual self-interest. We also need to understand that those aren't enough, but we need to be able to embrace the idea of sacrifice. Now, this is a very misunderstood word because people say, oh, sacrifice means suffering. Sacrifice means unpleasantness. And it's probably not the right word, but there wasn't quite a better word. I don't see a better word to use. I could say self-offering instead of sacrifice. The words interest, lowercase s, needs to be turned into self-offering. But I don't think that quite conveys enough, because yes, we have to offer ourselves. We have to do that. So it's a combination, self-offering of the little self, but it's also sacrificing, letting go of those things that are holding us back from that. Self-transcendence might work, but it implies more of the goal rather than the process or the path. And when I say sacrifice, what is it that we're asked beyond enlightened self-interest for the devotee? We need to sacrifice our likes and our dislikes. We need to sacrifice the little self for the higher self. We need to sacrifice the lesser for the greater. Now, unfortunately, this seems to imply to people, well, that's going to be painful. And admittedly, it must be that way to people, because when you're embraced in the little self, when you embrace the ego consciousness, it does seem, and this is Arjuna's dilemma. If I get rid of the little self, I'll have nothing. There'll be nothing there for me. And that's painful psychologically. But Krishna, the whole discourse of the Krishna underneath it is implying, no, you give up nothing. You embrace everything, is what it is. Nothing is given up. Everything is embraced. But until we reach that point, we're in this dilemma where we're bound by this ego consciousness. I remember a story that Swami Kriyananda told about himself. He said when he first came to Master, he was, he was aware that he was bound by ego. He had ego consciousness. He was proud in certain ways about himself, and different. He wanted to become humble. Now, and then after a period of time, he began to realize, he was making some progress. He was more humble than he was before. And then he realized, to his chagrin, I'm just proud of my humility. So now I've just instead of being proud of my intellectuality or my accomplishments or my other abilities, now I'm just proud of my humility. It's not so easy just to get rid of everything. And it seemed like to him at that time, there's no escape. We're stuck. And he came to learn, though, and this is what Paramhansa Yogananda teaches us, that true humility is not debasing oneself. It's not, denying one's accomplishments or anything like that. Humility really is forgetfulness of the little self. You become so focused on the other that there's no you there to even be humble. As Master, a disciple complimented Master once. He says, that Master was being, in an outward sense, he was being humble. And the disciple complimented Master about his humility. And Master said back to him, says, how can there be humility when there's no consciousness of ego? And in other words, there's no ego I, little I, to be humble. And this is the stage that mankind is moving toward generally as the yugas progress from Dwapara to Treta Yuga, and in the far future, is the ability to transcend the little ego self. And this is what all of us as devotees are trying to do, but we must move through that stage of enlightened self-interest to realize that the world, by my helping others, my expanding my little self to include others, little by little by little, I expand my sense of awareness, my sympathies, until finally, in the process of that, we purify ourselves till where we can we forget the little self. And we get to the point where all of our actions are done in attunement with God's will. And this process of attuning ourselves with God's will is a form, with attuning to higher Dharma, let's say that, the sacrifice. It's a sacrifice of our likes and dislikes, or as Master put it in the autobiography of a yogi, it's a sacrifice of his whims and fancies to get rid of our guidance in life that is dictated by whims and fancies, the ability to allow that to be sacrificed. And how did he do that? He did it by attuning his will to something higher. He attuned his will to his guru's will, in this case. And the result is that when you attune, whether it's to your guru's will or you attune to God, you attune to an expression. And for us, you could say, to bring that down into our daily parlance, it's how do we know to do the right thing? It's learning to do the right thing in all circumstances. A learning to attune to Dharma means learning to let go of the ego desires, the ego will. And how do we do that? And it's by learning to immerse ourselves into God, or you might say a little bit more practically, allow ourselves to be guided by immersing ourselves in divine consciousness. To have one's consciousness suffused in God's joy, suffused in God's peace, God's love, etc. And this is exactly what we try to do when we meditate. This is what we attempt to achieve when we practice Kriya. This is what we attempt to achieve. We try, you see. I don't say we always accomplish it, but we try to accomplish this when we take the peace we enjoy in meditation and to bring it into our actions. You see, we suffuse ourselves in an ocean of peace, let's say. And then to the degree that we can do every action in our daily life suffused in that consciousness, we find ourselves guided correctly to do the highest dharma. Now, it's not either or, it's gradational, it's directional. In other words, if we're in a little bit of peace or joy, let's say, or God's love, if we suffuse ourselves in God's love, we're likely to do a little bit of dharma. You could say our dharma is going to, that it'll affect us somewhat. If we're completely in God's consciousness, we'll be completely acting in dharma. And you see, this is the direction that we want to go. Now, dharma, this brings up the point that we have to remember. Again, I mentioned that everyone's dharma is not defined by the outer action itself. It's not defined by the behavior. In other words, one size fits all. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not, etc., etc. So outwardly, the commandment says you shouldn't do that. So that's the dharma. Well, no. When you're in God consciousness, dharma is determined by God's will. So what is God's will? If you're in divine love, divine immersion with the high consciousness, you're going to be guided by that consciousness to do the right thing, whatever that might be. Probably it will be not to kill, or not to rob from your neighbor, or because it would just be adharmic. And when you're in dharma, you do the right thing. But the outward expression of that dharma is situational, depending upon circumstances that may be before you. So you find that this is the direction we're going, that we want to, you could say this is the direction that comes when we sacrifice the little self for the higher self, and we take on the action appropriate as guided by the higher self. Now, I give you an example. It's from the Bible. Jesus is about to be crucified, and he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he doesn't want to be crucified. It's not like he has no thought about it, and he realizes he knows what's coming, and he prays to God because he's preparing himself, meditating. He's in prayer to God. He knows what's coming, and he prays to God, let this cup pass from me. In other words, this cup of circumstances that are going to come and be crucified, let this cup pass from me, but thy will be done, not mine. In other words, if it's not mine to be crucified, let it go. I don't let it pass from me. But if it's thy will, let it be done. And so this is the sacrifice of my likes and dislikes in favor of God's likes and dislikes, in favor of this body's likes and dislikes, in favor of this ego's likes and dislikes, in favor of any of that. We attune ourselves, let me do the right thing. Let me do thy dharma, Lord. And in that, we find that we are in tune with grace, the flow of grace. And grace is power, by the way. Jesus didn't have to be crucified. If it would have been, he felt God's will, he could have resisted that easily. Remember when the soldiers come to take him, they arrest him. One of his disciples, Peter, pulls out his sword and begins to fight and chops off the ear of one of the Roman soldiers. And Christ stops him. He said, don't do, but Peter wasn't yet in tune at that point. And Christ puts his hand on the soldier, his ear, and he's immediately healed. Now, he had the power to do that. you see. So he could have obviously resisted and done something else, but it wasn't God's will for him. So that's what he did. And in every age, there are souls who live their lives in this light. They're emissaries of that Dharma. Now, the great ones, of course, are the saints, the great saints, the avatars that come again and again. But they're not coming to show us how great they were. They're showing us to be an example of how great we potentially can be. And in order for us to do that, we must sacrifice. But it's the sacrifice of the little self for the higher self. And you could say that this overtone that people say, well, oh gosh, sacrifice. I don't want to sacrifice. And where's the sacrifice? I'm joyful. And that's true. You find that when you live in joy, there is no such thing as suffering in the terms of that outer sacrifice. And you could sort of like remember the sleepless saint. You know, he says, oh, disciples say to him, how much you sacrifice, because he was born a rich, inheriting of a rich fortune. And he gave it all away. And he says, where was the sacrifice? He says to his disciple, I gave up a few paltry rupees in exchange for a kingdom of bliss. And so it is for us. We give up a few paltry likes and dislikes for a kingdom of bliss. And this is the next stage that's awaiting each one of us. You could say, like, to those persons who think of sacrifice as suffering, they don't understand the joy of living in God. And they might ask, a person might, you know, that story of Master where he talks about going, seeing all the villagers saw the mountain in the dusty village. And they said, oh, it's so beautiful. I wish I could go, but it's much too high. And Master saw it. And he said, so beautiful. No one else will go. I will go. And some person might say to a mountain climber, why go out and climb a high mountain? I'd rather just sit home and sit in a comfortable chair and at home and watch a movie or somebody else climbing a mountain. Climbing mountains is hard. It's suffering. The body, it aches and pains. You go through all this trouble. You got to sleep on hard ground, endure cold weather. Why do those people climb Mount Everest? Well, mountain climbing is difficult, and sometimes it is unpleasant. It's exhausting. It's full of hardship. And the fellow in the armchair at home says, I don't want to do any of that. But the climber knows that there's something more. For the climber, the ascent is fun. It's enjoyable. It's joyful. It's meaningful. It's exhilarating. It gives purpose to their lives. It's fulfilling to them. And the climber is willing to sacrifice all of the petty things, all of these little petty concerns of the man at home in his lounge chair. He feels pity for such a person. Maybe that's not the right word. Maybe he feels, if he's a higher consciousness, he'd feel compassionate because he realizes that the sitter at home doesn't know what he's missing and might wish, and maybe the mountain climber might even wish to encourage him. And this is what the saints do. They do feel perhaps some pity, but they feel more so, they feel compassion. So if you think of sacrifice in the spiritual sense as difficult, think about as suffering, well, you just haven't experienced the higher aspects of what comes from the sacrifice of the little self in the embrace of the higher self. But I want to conclude by saying a couple of points. We need to have, in every age, there are high souls. And in every age, it's like you could say a wave. There's people on both ends of the spectrum, but the age is defined by the majority of people's consciousness. So in Kali Yuga, there were great saints who understood more than what the confines or the restrictions of that age were and aspired In this age of Dwapar, it's defined by self-interest, whether it's personal or enlightened, either one. One is better than the other, but it's defined by that. But nevertheless, there are still people living in consciousness of Kali, and we see that readily. But there are also those who are living by a higher consciousness of a higher age. And that, you could say, is necessary because there is a leading wave. It's like a wave of consciousness, and the forward thrust of that wave are those who see beyond merely personal self-interest, enlightened self-interest, to abandonment of self-interest in toto, in an embrace of God. And those people are the way showers for the future. Those people who will give inspiration to everybody, because we need to have that. And I think the gurus come to show that potential of what is there for all of us. And those who want to be in tune with the guru need to, as Paramhansa Yogananda said, serve my work. Now, he didn't mean handing out pamphlets. Probably didn't even mean giving lectures. He meant serve my work by being in tune and living your life by the highest dharma. And he gave us the tools to be able to do that. And to truly serve his work as a disciple is to practice that what he taught, to take up those tools and not just talk about them, admire them. Oh, what a beautiful tool. Use it. Change our consciousness. Become a warrior for life, to use that image, you might say, which is appropriate of the Bhagavad Gita. Krishna asking Arjuna, the warrior, to take up his bow and fight the battle. Do what is right. But to know what is right is to be in the consciousness of right, in the consciousness of Dharma, and use the tools that the masters have given us. And we find that in doing that, we act appropriately according to the consciousness in which we live, and then help others. But a piece of advice: be practical in your idealism in helping others. We have to help people according to what is going to be useful for them. So we reach down. And I think in this age, you're going to find people who are still living in Kali Yuga, perhaps. You inspire them to seek happiness. Then there are those who are seeking happiness. Inspire them by helping them to see that their happiness is greater to the degree that they expand their consciousness to help other people. And that's the message really for most people in this age. But then there are some also that want to go beyond that. Help them by learning to embrace the light and make it their reality as well, through giving them the tools to be able to do that. And that's what Master brought us. He brought us the tools. And by merging our own consciousness and being an example of that, we serve that light to the highest potential. And so let's take these thoughts and see in what way can we make them a reality for our own lives and be an example. You could say, be a warrior of light, be a true disciple of the great ones. So whether it's our particular path, our particular guru, Paramhansa Yogananda, or perhaps all of the great ones, they speak the same language. And it's the language of love, it's the language of joy, and it's a language of learning to do the right thing, to do Dharma, live in Dharma. So God bless all of you. And